The sun was starting to set on what had been a pretty normal Tuesday evening. State Attorney Daniella Washington rubbed her tired eyes as she pulled out of the courthouse parking garage. It had been one of those long days. The kind where coffee becomes a lifeline and lunch is whatever snack you can grab between meetings. She'd just won a tough case against a corrupt businessman who'd been stealing from elderly folks' retirement funds. The victory felt good, but now her mind was racing with all the other cases piling up on her desk. That's the thing about being a state attorney. There's always another person who needs justice, always another case that keeps you up at night. The streets were quiet as she drove through her neighborhood. The trees lined the road, their leaves casting dancing shadows in the golden evening light. She'd lived here for almost 10 years now, and she loved how peaceful it felt after a hectic day at work. Kids were playing basketball in their driveways, and the local ice cream truck was making its final rounds, its familiar tune floating through the air. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since morning. She decided to make a quick stop at Joe's Deli, a little family-owned place she'd been going to for years. The owner's face lit up when she walked in. "The usual?" he asked with a warm smile. She nodded, grateful for these small moments of normalcy in her busy life. Back in her car, the smell of fresh soup and sandwich filled the air. She was looking forward to getting home, kicking off her heels, and maybe even catching up on that new legal drama everyone at the office had been talking about. The case files could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was for unwinding. She checked her mirrors out of habit as she pulled back onto the main road. Everything was exactly as it should be. She'd been driving these streets for years and knew every stop sign, every speed limit change. Her car was well maintained, her insurance up to date, and she always followed traffic rules to the letter. It wasn't just about being a law-abiding citizen. As a state attorney, she knew she had to set an example. The sun had almost disappeared now, leaving behind a beautiful orange and purple sky. She adjusted her rearview mirror slightly to avoid the glare. That's when she noticed the police cruiser a few cars behind her. She didn't think much of it at first. Police cars were a normal sight in this neighborhood, and she knew most of the local officers through her work. But then the cruiser started moving closer, weaving through traffic to get behind her car. Still, she wasn't worried. She'd done nothing wrong, and besides, she'd handled countless traffic stops in her career, from both sides of the law. She knew the procedure inside and out. The flash of blue lights in her mirror caught her by surprise. She glanced down at her speedometer, exactly at the speed limit as always. Maybe they were just trying to get past her to an emergency. But no, the cruiser stayed right behind her, lights flashing insistently. Following protocol, she put on her turn signal and pulled over to the right, making sure to choose a well-lit spot where both she and the officer would be visible to passing traffic. She did everything by the book, turned off the engine, turned on the interior lights, placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Years of legal experience had taught her to be prepared for anything. Without making any sudden movements, she reached over and tapped the recording app on her phone, another habit she developed over years of working in the justice system. As she waited for the officer to approach, she caught a glimpse of his face in her side mirror. Something about his expression made her stomach tighten, and it wasn't from hunger anymore. The evening that had started so normally was about to become anything but. Through her rearview mirror, she watched the officer check something in his computer, taking his time before stepping out of his cruiser. His body language was tense, almost aggressive, as he adjusted his belt and began walking toward her car. In that moment, as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, State Attorney Washington had no idea that this routine traffic stop was about to spark a chain of events that would change not just her life, but her entire community. The officer's footsteps crunched on the gravel, slow and deliberate. State Attorney Washington could hear each step through her slightly opened window. Her heart wasn't racing. She'd been in too many high-pressure courtroom situations for that. But there was a familiar tightness in her chest, the kind that comes when you know something isn't quite right. The beam from his flashlight swept across her car, much brighter than necessary given the streetlights overhead. It lingered on her rear license plate, then her State Bar Association parking sticker, before finally hitting her side mirror at an angle that forced her to squint. She kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, remembering all the times she'd advised young law students about proper conduct during traffic stops. license and registration. The words came out clipped and harsh, without even a good evening to soften them. Officer Barrett's face was partially hidden in shadow, but his tone said everything about his attitude. Washington could feel the hostility rolling off him in waves. She kept her voice steady and professional, the same voice she used when dealing with difficult witnesses in court. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Her right hand moved slowly, deliberately toward her purse on the passenger seat. "I said license and registration." He cut her off, his hand resting meaningfully on his holster. "And while you're at it, explain why you're driving with illegal window tints in my jurisdiction." Washington blinked in surprise. She'd bought this car brand new from the dealership 3 years ago, and everything was up to code. She'd made sure of it. "Officer, these are factory standard windows. I have the documentation right here with my registration." She reached for her glove compartment, moving with exaggerated slowness. Inside was a neat folder containing everything: registration, insurance, and yes, the window tint certification. But before she could pull it out, Officer Barrett's flashlight beam suddenly flooded the car's interior. "Keep your hands where I can see them." His voice had risen sharply. "Any sudden movements and—" "Officer," Washington interrupted calmly, though her heart had picked up its pace. "I'm reaching for my documents, as you requested, and I should inform you that I'm also the state attorney for this district." She pulled out her credentials along with her driver's license, holding them up where the light could catch the official seal. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt much longer. Washington watched Officer Barrett's face as he processed this information. She'd seen that look before, the moment when someone realizes they might have made a serious mistake, but is too proud or too angry to back down. Instead of becoming more professional, his face hardened. "Step out of the vehicle." The words came through clenched teeth. "Officer, I don't believe that's necessary. I'm happy to discuss the window tint issue, but—" I said, "Step out of the vehicle." His voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Or are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" Through her open window, Washington could see people on their porches across the street. A couple had their phones out, recording. Mrs. Chen from the corner house was on her phone, probably calling the police station. Even the kids who had been playing basketball had stopped to watch. Washington weighed her options. As a state attorney, she knew her rights better than most. She also knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control, how often they ended badly, especially when someone tried to assert their rights. She'd seen too many cases cross her desk where things went wrong in just seconds. "I'll step out," she said clearly, making sure her voice would carry to the witnesses across the street. "But I want to state for the record that I'm complying under protest, and I believe this stop is unlawful." She reached for her door handle, but Officer Barrett was already yanking it open. The evening air hit her face as she carefully swung her legs out, keeping her movements slow and controlled. Her heels crunched on the gravel, the same sound she'd heard from his boots just minutes earlier. As she straightened up, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the car window. She was still wearing her court suit, navy blue, conservative, professional. Her state attorney's badge was clearly visible on her lapel. Anyone looking at her would see exactly what she was: a professional, a public servant, someone who had dedicated her life to upholding the law. But Officer Barrett wasn't seeing any of that. His face was twisted with something that went beyond simple authority or even anger. He grabbed her arm roughly, spinning her around to face her car. "Hands on the vehicle," he barked. "Spread your legs." "Officer, this is completely unnecessary," Washington said, her voice still calm but louder now, making sure the growing crowd of witnesses could hear. "I've shown you my credentials. I'm a state attorney, and this stop is—" "Stop resisting," he shouted, though she hadn't moved a muscle. The steel of handcuffs bit into her wrists before she could finish her sentence. The whole scene had taken on a surreal quality. The sweet evening air still smelled like her cooling suit from Joe's Deli. Someone's wind chimes tinkled softly in the distance, and here she was, a state attorney being handcuffed outside her own car, less than a mile from her house, for absolute nothing. She could hear the murmurs from the growing crowd, the clicks of phone cameras, someone saying this isn't right. But Officer Barrett seemed beyond caring about witnesses now. He was in too deep, and like many people who know they've made a mistake but can't admit it, he was only pushing harder in the wrong direction. As he began reciting her rights she could probably recite in her sleep, Washington caught the eye of young Mr. Thompson across the street. He was already on the phone, and she could read his lips as he spoke urgently. "Chief, you need to get down here right now. One of your officers is arresting the state attorney." The situation had officially spiraled beyond a simple traffic stop. What happened in the next few minutes would have consequences that would ripple through the entire community. But right now, standing there with her hands cuffed behind her back, Washington was already thinking like a prosecutor. Every detail, every word, every action was being filed away in her mind. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been stopped without cause, every citizen who'd ever faced abuse of power. And she was in a unique position to do something about it. The metal handcuffs bit into Washington's wrists as Officer Barrett roughly guided her toward his patrol car. The neighborhood had gone eerily quiet. No more kids playing, no more ice cream truck music, just the sound of crickets and the soft whir of phone cameras recording everything. The whole scene felt like something out of a bad dream, but the cold metal against her skin reminded her this was all too real. "Watch your head," Officer Barrett said, but it wasn't a courtesy. He was already pushing her down before the words were fully out of his mouth. She had to twist awkwardly to avoid hitting her head on the car frame. The backseat smelled like stale coffee and something else she didn't want to think about. Through the partition, she could hear Officer Barrett calling in the arrest on his radio. "Dispatch, I've got one in custody for resisting arrest and interference with a police officer." His voice had that forced calm of someone trying to sound professional while knowing they've made a serious mistake. Washington shifted uncomfortably in the seat, her court suit getting wrinkled against the plastic covering. She could see her own car through the window, driver's door still open, interior lights still glowing. Her phone was still recording in there, catching every word, every sound. Her dinner from Joe's Deli would be getting cold, but that was the least of her concerns right now. Across the street, the crowd had grown larger. Mrs. Chen was still on her phone, gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Mr. Thompson, the retired history teacher, was talking to some other neighbors, pointing at the patrol car and shaking his head. A few teenagers had their phones up, probably live-streaming the whole thing. "This is wrong," someone shouted from the crowd. "She's the state attorney." Officer Barrett spun around, his face red. "Clear the area. This is a police matter." But nobody moved. If anything, more people were coming out of their houses. Washington could see porch lights flicking on up and down the street. In the distance, she heard more sirens approaching. She wasn't sure if that was good news or bad news. Inside the patrol car, Washington closed her eyes for a moment, taking deep breaths. The handcuffs were tight enough to leave marks, and her shoulders were starting to ache from the awkward position. But her mind was clear, focused. She'd spent years prosecuting cases, and now she was living through exactly the kind of incident that too often got brushed under the rug. She started mentally documenting everything. The time, 7:43 p.m., according to the car's clock. The officer's badge number, clearly visible in her phone's recording, the witnesses, at least 15 people with cameras, the weather conditions, clear, still light enough to see clearly, and every word that had been exchanged. Years of preparing cases had taught her the importance of details. The approaching sirens got louder, and suddenly 3 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the street in rotating reds and blues. Washington recognized Chief Richardson stepping out of one of them. Even from inside the patrol car, she could see the look of disbelief on his face as he took in the scene. "Barrett." The chief's voice boomed across the street. "What in God's name are you doing?" Officer Barrett straightened up, trying to look confident. "Sir, I had a vehicle with illegal tints." The driver became confrontational and, "That driver," the chief cut him off, "is our state attorney. The same state attorney who spoke at our department's training day last month. The same state attorney whose office handles all our major cases." The crowd had gone quiet, everyone watching this exchange. Washington could see more phones coming out, more cameras recording. Tomorrow, this would be all over social media, all over the news. But right now, she was still sitting in the back of a patrol car with handcuffs cutting into her wrists. Chief Richardson walked over to the patrol car, his face a mix of concern and embarrassment as he peered in through the window. "Ms. Washington, I cannot begin to apologize for this situation. He turned to Barrett. Get those cuffs off her. Now. Officer Barrett hesitated, his face flushed. Sir, she was resisting. The dash cam says otherwise, one of the other officers interrupted. He was holding a tablet, probably streaming the camera feed. Chief, you need to see this. The whole stop was recorded. Washington could feel the tension in the air as Officer Barrett finally opened the back door. His hands were shaking slightly as he removed the handcuffs. She stepped out of the car carefully, maintaining her dignity despite the situation. Her wrists were red and marked from the tight cuffs, and she rubbed them gently as she straightened her jacket. The chief started to apologize again, but Washington held up a hand to stop him. Save it for the formal investigation, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet street, which I can assure you will be happening. She walked back to her car, aware of all the eyes watching her. Her phone was still recording when she picked it up. The soup from Joe's was completely cold now, but she had lost her appetite anyway. As she gathered her things, she could hear the chief reading Officer Barrett his rights, an ironic twist that wasn't lost on anyone present. A young officer approached her hesitantly with a notepad. Ma'am, we'll need your statement. You'll have it first thing in the morning, she replied, her prosecutor's voice back in full force, along with the video evidence, witness statements, and a formal complaint. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some calls to make. As she drove home, followed by concerned neighbors' eyes and the still flashing lights of police cars, Washington was already planning her next steps. This wasn't going to be just another internal affairs investigation that went nowhere. This was going to be the case that changed things. Because sometimes, she thought, justice needs a wake-up call. And tonight it had gotten one, complete with flashing lights and handcuffs. By midnight, the police station was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as officers and administrators rushed through the halls, the usual end-of-shift quiet shattered by urgent phone calls and hurried conversations. In the chief's office, phones wouldn't stop ringing. Calls from the mayor's office, the media, and civil rights organizations were pouring in nonstop. Detective Amy Chen sat at her desk in the Internal Affairs Division, surrounded by stacks of files and her third cup of coffee. She hadn't gone home when her shift ended at 6. Instead, she'd pulled out every traffic stop report from Officer Barrett's past 3 years on the force. Her eyes were tired, but she couldn't stop reading. With each file she opened, her stomach tightened a little more. You should see this, she called out to her supervisor, who was also burning the midnight oil. Last month, Barrett pulled over a cardiac surgeon. 2 weeks before that, a high school principal. Both times, he claimed their window tints were illegal. Both times, the cars had factory-standard windows. Her supervisor walked over, frowning at the papers spread across her desk. Any complaints filed? That's the interesting part, Chen replied, pulling up a spreadsheet on her computer. Both victims filed complaints, but somehow they never made it to our office. They're in the system, but they're marked as resolved with no follow-up documentation. Down the hall, in the tech department, 2 IT specialists were reviewing body camera footage. They'd started with tonight's incident, crystal clear video showing every moment of Barrett's aggressive behavior. But they didn't stop there. They were going through weeks of footage, building a pattern that became more disturbing with each video they watched. Look at this one tech said to the other, pointing at his screen. 3 weeks ago, he pulled over a respected local business owner. Same aggressive approach, same immediate hostility. But when he realized the driver had connections at City Hall, his whole attitude changed. The footage played on multiple screens, telling a story that couldn't be ignored. The pattern was clear. Barrett targeted successful, professional people who didn't fit his preconceptions of what success should look like. But until tonight, he'd been careful to back off if his target had obvious connections to power. In another part of the building, Officer Rodriguez couldn't sleep. He'd been Barrett's partner 2 years ago, before requesting a transfer. Now, sitting in the break room with a cold cup of coffee, he was writing down everything he could remember. Every incident he'd witnessed, every comment that had made him uncomfortable, every time he'd tried to report problems only to be told to let it go. "You okay?" asked a passing sergeant, noticing Rodriguez's troubled expression. "No," Rodriguez answered honestly. "I should have pushed harder when I reported him the first time." Maybe if I had, tonight wouldn't have happened. The sergeant sat down across from him. We all saw things we should have reported. But the system, it doesn't make it easy. The system's about to change, Rodriguez said, continuing to write. State Attorney Washington isn't going to let this slide. And honestly, I'm glad. We need this wake-up call. Meanwhile, in the records department, a young clerk was discovering something interesting. She'd been tasked with pulling all of Barrett's personnel files, but she'd found gaps, missing reports, incomplete reviews, evaluations that seemed surprisingly positive given the number of incidents in his record. Chief, she called, poking her head into his office. I think someone's been cleaning up Barrett's files. There are access logs showing file modifications from unauthorized terminals. Someone's been actively covering his tracks. The chief, looking 10 years older than he had that morning, rubbed his temples. How far does it go? That's the thing, sir, she replied. The unauthorized access isn't just in Barrett's files. It's systematic. Someone's been burying complaints against several officers for years. Up in the detective division, Detective Chen was putting together a timeline. She'd created a large board mapping out every incident, every complaint, every traffic stop. Red strings connected related events, creating a web of misconduct that stretched back years. Yellow sticky notes marked witness names and badge numbers. Green tabs identified evidence that still needed to be collected. Her phone buzzed. A text from a patrol officer she trusted. Check Barrett's traffic stops between 2 to 4 a.m. Pattern you need to see. Chen pulled up the data, and suddenly another piece clicked into place. Barrett had been targeting people leaving late-night shifts at the hospital, the 24-hour diner, the early morning bakery. Working people, tired people, people less likely to have the energy or resources to fight back against harassment. It was never just about prejudice, she muttered, adding another red string to her board. It was about power. He picked targets he thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back. The night wore on. In different corners of the station, people who had stayed quiet for years found their voices. Officers came forward with stories they'd been afraid to tell. Administrative staff dug up files they'd been told to bury. Its specialists recovered deleted emails and lost video footage. By dawn, Detective Chen's investigation board had grown to cover an entire wall. The evidence was overwhelming, not just against Barrett, but against a system that had protected him and others like him. The random traffic stop of a state attorney had cracked open something much bigger than one officer's misconduct. As the sun rose, casting long shadows through the station windows, Chen stepped back to look at her work. The board told a story of systemic failures, covered-up complaints, and broken trust. But it also showed something else: the names and faces of honest officers who had tried to report problems, community members who had filed complaints, witnesses who had spoken up only to be ignored. What do you think will happen now? Asked a rookie officer, staring at the board. Chen thought about State Attorney Washington, about the determination she'd seen in the woman's eyes even as she was being wrongfully arrested. Now, she said, adding one final note to her board. Now we fix it. All of it. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when the first news vans started appearing outside the police station. The videos from the previous night had spread like wildfire across social media. Cell phone footage from neighbors, dashboard camera video leaked by concerned officers, and security camera clips from nearby houses all told the same story. A respected state attorney, handcuffed and arrested for nothing more than driving her own car in her own neighborhood. By 8 a.m., the sidewalks were filled with local residents holding handmade signs. Justice for all read one. End police harassment, declared another. But these weren't the angry, violent protests that some had feared. Instead, the crowd was remarkably diverse and organized. Teachers stood next to shop owners. Nurses in scrubs who just finished night shifts stood beside suited office workers on their way to work. Mrs. Chen from the corner house had set up a table with coffee and water for the protesters. I've lived here 30 years, she told a local reporter. I've seen good police officers and bad ones. But last night, that wasn't about one bad officer. That was about a system that lets bad officers think they can get away with anything. Inside her home office, Washington was reviewing the footage from her phone for the 10th time. Her wrists still showed faint marks from the handcuffs, but her mind was sharp and focused. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, calls from civil rights organizations, other state attorneys, even the governor's office. But it was the local calls that really caught her attention. "Ma'am," said the voice on her current call, "I'm a nurse at Central Hospital. 2 months ago, Officer Barrett pulled me over after my night shift. Same thing, claimed my windows were too dark. When I showed him my hospital ID, he got aggressive. I filed a complaint, but nothing ever happened." Washington added the nurse's information to her growing list. She'd already received dozens of similar calls: a teacher, a small business owner, a church deacon. Each story followed the same pattern. Each complaint had somehow vanished into the system without a trace. At the local coffee shop, the regular morning crowd was larger than usual. People who normally grabbed their coffee and ran were staying, sharing stories, comparing experiences. The owner, a former police officer himself, shook his head as he listened. "You know what breaks my heart?" he said to the gathered crowd. "Every bad officer makes it harder for the good ones to do their jobs. And there are so many good ones out there, officers who really want to protect and serve. But the system protects the bad ones and punishes anyone who speaks up." By midday, the local news had picked up another angle. Officer Rodriguez, Barrett's former partner, had agreed to an interview. He sat in the studio, still in his uniform, his face showing the strain of his decision. "I requested a transfer 2 years ago," he explained, his voice steady but emotional. "I saw things that weren't right. I reported them. But instead of investigating Barrett, they investigated me. Said I wasn't being a team player. That's the culture we're dealing with. Protect the bad actors, silence the good ones." The interview was playing on TV screens across the city. In diners, offices, and homes, people watched and recognized their own experiences. At the downtown courthouse, a group of lawyers gathered in the break room to watch, their usual professional rivalry forgotten in the face of this larger issue. "You know what's different this time?" one senior attorney asked the others. They picked the wrong target. State Attorney Washington knows the law inside and out. She knows exactly how the system works and how to fix it. Back at the protest, the crowd had grown but remained peaceful. Local religious leaders had arrived, calling for dialogue and change. Small business owners brought food and water for the protesters. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, too young to understand everything but old enough to know something important was happening. A young police officer on crowd control duty watched the scene with mixed emotions. "I joined the force to help people," she told her partner, "to serve the community. But how can we serve a community that's afraid of us? How can we protect people who don't trust us?" Her partner, a veteran of 20 years, nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what needs to change first, the trust. And maybe this is how it starts." At the local community center, an impromptu town hall meeting was forming. People from all walks of life crowded into the main room. The air conditioning struggled to keep up with the number of bodies, but nobody seemed to mind the heat. They were too busy sharing stories, comparing experiences, and most importantly, discussing solutions. "It's not enough to fire one officer," a community leader said, standing to address the crowd. "We need real change, better training, real oversight, a complaint system that actually works." An older officer in the back of the room stood up. "Some of us have been pushing for these changes for years. But now we have proof. Now we have a chance to make it happen." Outside the police station, the protest had taken on an almost festival-like atmosphere. Someone had brought a guitar. Children played on the grass while their parents talked. Officers and civilians shared bottles of water and stories of their own experiences. A news helicopter circled overhead, capturing the scene, not of chaos or violence, but of a community coming together. The footage showed the diversity of the crowd, the peaceful nature of the protest, the conversations happening between officers and civilians. Late in the afternoon, State Attorney Washington finally emerged from her office. She looked tired but determined as she approached the microphone stand that had been set up outside the courthouse. "What happened to me last night was wrong," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "But this isn't just about me. This is about every person who's ever been wrongly stopped, wrongly accused, wrongly treated. This is about a system that needs to change, and change starts now." The crowd erupted in applause, but Washington held up her hand for silence. "This isn't going to be quick or easy. Real change never is. But look around you. Look at this community coming together. This is how change begins. Not with violence or hatred, but with people standing together and saying enough. As the sun began to set on this extraordinary day, the mood in the city had shifted. What had started as outrage over one incident had transformed into something larger, a movement for real, lasting change. And it had happened not through violence or destruction, but through the power of a community finding its voice. Detective Chen's office in Internal Affairs looked like something from a crime movie. Every wall was covered with photos, documents, and sticky notes, all connected by a web of colored strings. She'd barely slept in 3 days, running on coffee and determination as she uncovered layer after layer of misconduct and cover-ups. "You need to see this," she called to the chief, who'd just walked in for their morning briefing. She pointed to a cluster of documents on her center board. These 17 complaints against Officer Barrett, they were all filed within the last year. All of them disappeared from our system within 48 hours of being submitted. The chief leaned in, his face growing darker as he read. The complaints came from respected community members, a pediatrician, a local business owner, a high school principal. Each one described similar experiences: unnecessary stops, aggressive behavior, threats of arrest, and each complaint had somehow vanished into thin air. "There's more," Chen continued, moving to her computer. "I checked the system access logs. Someone's been logging in after hours, deleting files, changing reports. But here's the interesting part. They weren't just targeting Barrett's files. Look at these other officers." She pulled up a spreadsheet showing dozens of names. Officers with multiple complaints that never saw the light of day. Reports that were altered or buried. Evidence that mysteriously disappeared. "How deep does this go?" the chief asked, his voice heavy. All the way to the top came a voice from the doorway. Officer Rodriguez stood there, holding a thick folder. "Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see these too." He spread out a series of old reports on Chen's desk. They dated back 5 years, showing a clear pattern. Every time an officer tried to report misconduct, they found themselves transferred, passed over for promotion, or facing trumped-up disciplinary charges. "I wasn't the only one who tried to speak up," Rodriguez explained. "But the system was rigged to protect the wrong people. Good officers got pushed out or silenced. Bad ones got promoted." In another part of the station, the tech team had made their own breakthrough. They'd recovered years of deleted emails, revealing a network of senior officers who worked together to bury complaints and protect problem officers. "Look at this exchange," one tech said, pointing to his screen. "When that bank manager filed a complaint last year about Barrett's behavior, Lieutenant Parker immediately emailed 3 other supervisors. They coordinated to discredit the complaint before it could even be investigated. The evidence was damning. It showed not just individual misconduct, but a systematic effort to hide problems and silence whistleblowers. The corruption went far beyond one officer's racist actions. It revealed a culture of protection and denial that had festered for years." In the break room, younger officers gathered to discuss the revelations. Many had witnessed problems but felt powerless to speak up. Now, with everything coming to light, they felt a mix of vindication and anger. "Remember when I tried to report that illegal search last year?" One officer said to his colleagues. "They told me I was being oversensitive, said I needed to learn how things really work. Now we know how things really worked. They were covering for each other while good cops took the blame." The investigation had opened floodgates. More officers came forward with stories and evidence. Administrative staff brought forward documents they'd been ordered to lose. Even retired officers called in, sharing experiences from years ago that suddenly fit into the larger pattern. Detective Chen added each new piece to her investigation board. The picture it painted was both disturbing and hopeful, disturbing in its reveal of widespread corruption, but hopeful because people were finally speaking up. "You know what's interesting?" she said to her team during their afternoon meeting. "Barrett's arrest of State Attorney Washington wasn't just a mistake, it was a tipping point. He'd gotten so used to operating with impunity that he didn't even think twice about arresting someone with the power to expose everything." The investigation spread beyond Barrett. Lieutenant Parker was placed on administrative leave after emails showed his role in burying complaints. 2 surgeons were suspended when their involvement in evidence tampering came to light. The police union representative who had initially defended Barrett now faced questions about his role in discrediting whistleblowers. By evening, Chen's investigation board had grown so large it spilled into the hallway. Officers stopped to look at it throughout the day, some adding their own stories, others just standing there in silence as they absorbed the scope of what had been uncovered. "It's like a house of cards," one veteran officer remarked, studying the board. "Pull out one piece, one bad traffic stop, and the whole thing starts to collapse." In the chief's office, a meeting with State Attorney Washington was underway. She sat reviewing Chen's preliminary report, her expression grave but determined. "This goes beyond criminal charges against individual officers," she said, looking up from the documents. "This is about dismantling a system that protected abusers and punished good officers who tried to stop them." The chief nodded slowly. "How do we even begin to fix something this broken?" Washington stood, walking to the window where she could see protesters still gathered peacefully outside. "We start by telling the truth. All of it. No more cover-ups, no more buried complaints, no more punishing officers who speak up. We show every officer and every citizen that things are really going to change." As night fell over the station, Detective Chen finally allowed herself to rest. Her investigation board told a story bigger than one traffic stop, bigger than one racist officer. It told the story of systemic failure, but also of hope. Hope that with everything now exposed to light, real change could finally begin. The truth had been buried for years, hidden behind badges and bureaucracy. But sometimes it takes just one incident, one moment of clear injustice, to bring everything crumbling down. And from those ruins, something better could be built. A system that truly served and protected everyone equally. The courthouse was packed on the morning of Officer Barrett's hearing. People lined up around the block, hoping to witness what many called a turning point in their community's history. Inside, every bench was filled with faces that told their own stories of encounters with police misconduct. State Attorney Washington stood at the prosecutor's table, her posture straight and confident. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence not just about Barrett's actions on that fateful night, but about years of systematic abuse and cover-ups. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "this case is about more than one traffic stop or one officer's actions. It's about a system that failed its citizens and the officers who tried to serve them honorably." The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage played on the courtroom screens, not just from Washington's arrest, but from dozens of similar incidents. Each clip showed the same pattern of harassment, the same abuse of power, the same targeting of individuals who Barrett thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back. Detective Chen took the stand, walking the court through her investigation findings. Her testimony painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond one officer's actions. She described deleted complaints, altered reports, and a network of supervisors who worked to protect problem officers while punishing those who spoke up. The system wasn't broken, Chen testified, gesturing to her investigation boards, now mounted as evidence. It was working exactly as certain people wanted it to work, to protect those who abused their power and silence those who tried to stop them. Officer Rodriguez testified next, his voice sometimes shaking but never wavering as he described his experiences as Barrett's former partner. He talked about the incidents he witnessed, the reports he filed that disappeared, and the retaliation he faced for speaking up. "I became a police officer to help people," he said, looking directly at the judge. "But the system forced good officers to choose between staying quiet about wrong things or facing punishment for doing right." Throughout the proceedings, Barrett sat at the defense table, his face a mask of disbelief. The power he'd wielded for so long had evaporated. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, stripped away another layer of protection he'd thought untouchable. But the most powerful moments came from community members. One by one, they took the stand to share their stories. The nurse who was harassed after her night shift. The teacher who was threatened with arrest for asking why he was stopped. The business owner whose complaint mysteriously vanished. Mrs. Chen, still wearing her apron from the corner store, described how she'd watched similar incidents for years. "Every time, we thought nothing would change," she testified. "But when they arrested our state attorney, something finally broke. People weren't afraid to speak up anymore." The judge listened to everything, her expression growing graver with each testimony. When all the evidence was presented, she took only a short time to reach her decision. Barrett wasn't just fired. He faced criminal charges for civil rights violations, along with several supervisors who had helped cover up misconduct. But Washington wasn't finished. In the weeks that followed, she worked with reform-minded officers and community leaders to implement real changes. The department established a new oversight system with civilian involvement in reviewing complaints. Every traffic stop was now recorded and reviewed. Officers received enhanced training on bias and community relations. Most importantly, the department's culture began to shift. Good officers who had stayed quiet out of fear now felt empowered to report problems. The blue wall of silence began to crumble, replaced by a commitment to transparency and accountability. The community noticed the changes. Traffic stops became more professional, more respectful. Officers spent more time walking neighborhoods, getting to know residents, building trust. The us versus them mentality began to fade, replaced by a genuine sense of partnership between police and community. At the police academy, new recruits now learned about Barrett's case as an example of what not to do. They studied the investigation that brought down not just one officer, but an entire system of corruption. They learned that their highest duty wasn't to protect other officers, but to protect the trust the community placed in them. 1 year after her arrest, Washington stood before a new graduating class of police officers. The auditorium was filled with fresh faces eager to serve their community the right way. "Your badge is not a shield from accountability," she told them. "It's a symbol of public trust. Every time you put on that uniform, remember that trust is earned through actions, through respect, through treating every person with the dignity they deserve." In the audience, Detective Chen sat with Officer Rodriguez, both now instructors at the academy. They watched as the new officers took their oath, knowing these recruits would serve under a different system, one built on transparency, accountability, and mutual respect. The story didn't end with Barrett's conviction, or even with the department's reforms. It continued in the daily interactions between officers and citizens, in the growing trust between police and community, in the knowledge that speaking up about wrongdoing would be rewarded, not punished. Mrs. Chen still ran her corner store, but now she knew the names of officers who patrolled her street. They stopped in for coffee, chatted with customers, became part of the community they served. The fear and suspicion that had poisoned police-community relations for so long began to heal. Washington kept the handcuffs from that night, mounted in a small display case in her office. They served as a reminder that justice sometimes comes from unexpected places, that change often starts with one person willing to stand up, and that even the darkest moments can lead to positive transformation. The city had learned valuable lessons. True justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about creating systems that prevent abuse and protect both citizens and good officers. Real change doesn't come from top-down orders, but from communities and police working together to build trust and understanding. And sometimes it takes one incident, one moment of clear injustice, to spark the changes that should have happened long ago. The night Washington was arrested didn't just end one officer's career. It began a new chapter in how police and communities could work together for the good of all.